Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this EU democracy reform conversation, organised under the auspices of the EPC's EU Democracy Reform Observatory, which aims to foster discussion on the future of the European integration process in the context of an enlarging union at this critical juncture and against the backdrop of a new era where we are facing fundamental geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges, development shocks, major transformation, and fundamental challenges related to the future of liberal democracy. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and I have the privilege of moderating these conversations as today we hope to discuss, the future of enlargement and EU reform, the candidates' perspectives. We started a little late because we are waiting for the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine to join us. I'm sure you'll appreciate always some challenges in connecting. We are informed that he will connect, he is connecting, and will be with us shortly. Taras Kashka, Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration in Ukraine, and he'll be in discussion with Yanis Emanuelidis, the EPC's Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, and Corina Stratolat, EPC Associate Director and Head of the European Politics and Institution Programmes. If you want to join in our conversation, please use the Q&A button and write your question, and please be brief. While we are waiting for the Deputy Prime Minister, Yanis, let's just have a quick look at what happened at the European Council last week, because we discussed on a separate webinar, EPC update last week, the discussion about frozen Russian assets and what to do about them. But we didn't so much focus on what it says about enlargement. And those conclusions reaffirming, and I quote, the EU's steadfast support for Ukraine's path towards EU membership and the significant progress Ukraine has achieved. I see we have the Deputy Prime Minister with us. Very warm welcome to you, sir. If you could.
Welcome. Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. Taras Kashka, the Deputy Prime Minister, as I said, for European and Euro-Atlantic integration in Ukraine. We really appreciate you being with us. I was just reading out, Deputy Prime Minister, what the European Council said last week about the enlargement process and reaffirming its steadfast support for your path towards EU membership and welcoming the significant progress you have achieved so far under the most challenging of circumstances. I just wanted to ask you what your assessment is of where the EU is now in terms of its approach to enlargement. Do you still have faith in the process, or do you have some concerns that promises that have been made may not be kept? What's your feeling about where we are now?
I think that indeed it's somewhere in the middle, because the situation is rather complex, so that we see that there is a political understanding that Ukraine should be part of the European Union together with Moldova and Western Balkans. This is so that we have particular situation as Ukraine has been targeted by Russian Federation and its aggression. For us, there is also consciousness that accession to the European Union is as well one of security guarantees, or let's say it's it's one of cornerstone of global security balance in Europe for the decades to come. And at the same time, we see that the EU is maybe a little bit like a step behind in terms of procedures and the methodology that is used. So it is not a political problem per se. This is something where I think that now the consciousness that the EU should be more efficient is there, and I'm glad that the debate about shifting to QMV in internal methodology of accession is there, and more, let's say, bigger share of the EU member states are supporting this idea, and there are some member states who are hesitating. So that's why I think that from textbooks on EU I think that we can learn the lesson that there is always someone who block for or vetoes for long or tactically the accession talks with different member states. I think that the Denmark that has presidency now waited for several years when France blocked any enlargement, and so that's why I think that I think that we will overcome the Hungarian veto for us, but generally I think that the procedures should fit the reality as well. So that's why I think that the continuation of work on shifting to QMV, at least for let's say internal decisions or let's say for internal decisions within the enlargement process is necessary, not only for Ukraine but for everyone. Yeah. Thank
Let
you.
me follow up on that before I come to Yanis and to Corinna. You said, and as I say, they're looking at, as you just mentioned, moving to QMV for opening chapters. They're looking at focusing on the technical, the legal aspects, less than the political, to get things moving. When you say should heed the reality as well, what do you mean by that?
I think that you see that the enlargement process is so that we have 6 clusters, so that many tracks on the individual chapters. Some chapters are so that like in fundamentals you have a lot of roadmaps additionally to the chapters per se, so that this mechanics is really big. So 27 member states is a big number of, I think that the biggest number of states that voted in favor of accession, so that it was, I think, that managed last time with Croatia. Now I think that there is a very big political will to complete enlargement process with Western Balkans and Moldova and Ukraine. So that's why we need greater efficiency there, so that all member states should be heard and their position is essential for defining benchmarks, opening, closing, interim, so that all of them, but and also being conscious that's that according to the founding treaty, the final yes should be from all member states. So that also allows for greater efficiency in the middle. Yeah, so that's that QMV is really more efficient tool of confirming that in general, so that there is a way to advance in negotiations, bearing in mind that in the end, after all, it will require consent of all member states.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back on those benchmarks, on that roadmap to accession a little bit later on. But Corinna, from your perspective, and the Deputy Prime Minister there talking about that political, he says it's really more about the process and the methodology. Vast majority of member states politically have signed up. And yet, in your test of time paper that you published earlier this year, you said that the EU has long recognised enlargement as a geostrategic investment. Antonio Costa, the European Council President, at an EPC event earlier this year, talked about it being the best geopolitical investment the EU can make. And yet, as you've pointed out in your paper, the EU seems to have become more hesitant about enlargement, not more enthusiastic. Do you share the Deputy Prime Minister's optimism that politically, at least, notwithstanding the problems that we need to find a way round, he referred to Hungary, the EU is committed to this process now?
Yes, good afternoon, I guess, by now. Thank you, Jackie. Yes, I think it is politically committed, but in rhetorically. So in practice, I think that that political devotion still has to be proven. And for me, I have to admit it's not about the process. It's not about all these innovations we're constantly bringing into discussion and to the methodology, but it is about political will, about member states proving that they mean what they say. When they are recognizing enlargement as a geostrategic priority and in being in the interest of the Union, they still have to prove that. And I personally don't think that that QMV, agreeing on QMV, and by the way, the discussion about QMV was about getting rid of unanimity for the opening of negotiation chapters. It wasn't for the final decision regarding
as the
accession.
Deputy Prime Minister pointed out, yes.
Yes, which means at the end that we would just be kicking the can down the road because at a certain moment in time, we will have to come face to face with the decision of whether we want this to happen or not. So it's just prolonging the inevitable.
Indeed.
And also attempts to actually get member states to agree to QMV so far have failed. And the reason they have failed is because it's not just Hungary not wanting this, but other member states hiding behind it. So it is about political will and not about process or procedure.
Let's talk though about how we get there in a moment. But Yanis, we have one relatively positive view from the Deputy Prime Minister, one very pessimistic view from Karina. Where do you sit in the middle of them? And then I'd like to come back to the Deputy Prime Minister on where we go from here. Yanis.
I think they're both correct, because the Deputy Prime Minister Kachka is right if he says that there is an increasing understanding for the significance of enlargement. He said it is a cornerstone of global security balance, by the way, global security balance, not only European security balance, and this is very much correct. So I think politically, geopolitically, geostrategically, there is an understanding of how important it is for the EU to enlarge. And to enlarge is also a question of what kind of enlargement one has in mind. Are we talking about an enlargement which is very small, or are we talking a more ambitious enlargement? So that's also a question that still needs to be addressed. But yes, there is a momentum, a political momentum. On the other side, we also see that there is a hesitation on a good number of member states to make the process more efficient. So yes, we need to make the process more efficient. That would help, but there's a reason why we're not getting there, and that often has to do with the fact that there is a discrepancy between the Sunday speeches and declarations and promises which have been given, and let's not forget, to the Western Balkans for decades, and the reality on the ground. So both assessments are correct.
Briefly, and then I'd like to come to the Deputy Prime Minister. You talk in the paper that you published earlier this year about the EU thinking enlarged. What did you mean by that? Just very briefly, if you would.
Well, the basic understanding of that is that, and this term, by the way, was already used by me and by a colleague of mine before Big Bang enlargement 2004-07, that one envisages the EU as being in the process of enlarging or being already an enlarged EU. So if you reform the European Union, you need to make sure that you think of the reform of the EU as an EU of potentially 30+ member states.
Got you.
And also, a second dimension to it, that you involve future member states into the debates when it comes to the overall future of the EU, which, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, is not only the future of the EU 27, but it's a collective future which includes Ukraine and others.
Thank you very much for explaining that. I want to come back on this link between the enlargement discussions and the EU reform discussions in a moment. But before we do that, Deputy Prime Minister, from your perspective now, what do you want from the EU and member states, aside from the negotiations themselves? What do you want at this point to support your integration, to support your accession? The EPC paper calls for an enlargement roadmap to clarify steps, resources, timeframes. What for you would be essential in that roadmap to support you on this journey?
I think that this question is, first of all, resonates to the political agenda of the EU and Ukraine in general, but as well refers to, let's say, it's like more complex than just a formality. So that the set of all let's say list of requests or suggestions for Ukraine. I think that in the course of last 3.5 years, or almost 4 years, so that's February 2026 is not so far. Yes, almost 4 years of war. I think that the EU changed itself. So that's it is like how the EU thinks itself. So now the EU is more geopolitical and geoeconomic entity that needs to think defense more and in a more complex way for many reasons. But the biggest reason is obvious, that Russia will be our enemy, our threat to our security for many years to come. So that, of course, we have the hot war, so that this massive war that we have now is a problem here and now, and we need every element of support to Ukraine in order to survive, to be capable to defend ourselves. So that we need more armament, more support in infrastructure, in energy, in roads, connectivity, financial support, social support to people, and humanitarian support to people, Ukrainians living in the EU. So all diplomatic support, it is there. So that it is all these things are there. But the consciousness of the EU about the future role of the EU as a uniting tool for defense of Europe is something that is already in the, let's say, on the agenda and in the minds of member state leaders, but it should transform also into further strategic actions like enlargement, like building all defense initiatives, having clear vision on the future role of Ukrainian army in post-war period, etc., etc. So all the things that are the part of big design, so that you see that the EU is looking for these big projects. Internally, there is a big request for final completion of internal market. Yes, so that's Letta report, Draghi report, this logic of more simplified union. It is so that these big things are also important for the let's say outer borders of the EU, and these outer borders are not borders between Poland and Ukraine, but this is really like front line of border between Russia and Ukraine, because we are defending Europe together, and that's why enlargement should be perceived from this perspective. And as well, so just to conclude, I think that we need to use the let's say bravery of the EU to take on board the big initiatives like macro-financial support to Ukraine, for example, that can be an example also for intra-EU reforms. So that's what we hear is that, for example, there is no single financial market for within the EU. Yes, because there are borders, like invisible borders between financial sectors of France and Germany and Italy. This doesn't work like unified market. But at the same time, the governments of the European Union are capable to design programs of financial support to Ukraine that are really joint. This is not like formality within the EU. This is something creative between member states and the EU. And I think that this political energy should be used also for the domestic reform. So that's why I think that what we want is to treat enlargement in this context, in this broader context, and then it will make it more, let's say, rational to make some adjustment in the accession process. But at the same time, we are not requesting any shortcuts. We still believe that it should be merit-based process, because this is the only way to succeed in integrating into the EU economic engine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Quick reaction, Yanis and Karina, to that, and then I want to come back to the Deputy Prime Minister's talk there about the links between support for enlargement and indeed the influence of Ukraine on the reform debate within the EU. But Yanis, in terms of that enlargement roadmap and the issues, I mean, as I understand the Deputy Prime Minister, it's fundamentally many of the things the EU is supporting now and is talking about supporting in 26, 27 are both linked to reconstruction and recovery whenever the war ends, and to the process of preparing for enlargement. Is that how you see it?
I will probably use different words than the Deputy Prime Minister, but for me, the important notion is that we understand, and when I say we, I mean the EU27 and those who want to join, but especially the EU27, that an enlargement is in our interest. It's not that enlargement is something where we're being asked from others who want to join the club and we're doing them a favor, but that it is in our geopolitical, in our geoeconomic interest for the EU to enlarge. This is also why we called our paper a test of times, meaning that if the EU actually is not able to enlarge and not also able to reform itself in the context of an enlarging EU, it will fail not only with respect to enlargement and reform, but it will fail in more general terms. That's why it is a test of times. And you're right, Deputy Prime Minister, that one needs to see it from the perspective of the EU doing the things it needs to do on its side when it comes to the single market, when it comes to the next MFF, when it comes to cohesion policy, when it comes to defense, when it comes to so many things which are now high on the agenda of the European Union and should be high on the agenda of the European Union. The European Union requires a different mindset. It needs to change its mindset, not only when it comes to actually implementing the enlargement process, but also when it comes to reforming it itself. And unfortunately, we see that this is something which the EU27, although they have understood that more needs to be done, that the level of ambition needs to be higher because of the geostrategic, the geopolitical, the geoeconomic pressures, that living up to that is something which EU is still very much struggling for. So if you look into the single market completion, this is something we have been discussing for many years. If you look into the need for a savings and investment union, this is something we have been discussing for many years. And I could go on. Even in core areas of defense, there is still, I think, not the level of ambition that is required, where, by the way, Ukraine is a huge asset. So my overall thing is that we need to think of enlargement being in the interest of those who want to join, in the interest of the EU, and that also requires reform.
So a hugely important change of narrative. Deputy Minister, I'll give you a chance to react to that in a moment. Corinna.
No, I mean, what I can add is that for sure, enlargement and reform are linked. I would say that enlargement is an excuse in reality for or can be an excuse for the EU to pursue reform, which it needs irrespective of enlargement, because there is unfinished business from previous crises, there are ongoing challenges, and there are certain future shocks in the cards for which the EU needs to get in better shape to be able to deal with those. So reform is a necessity. Enlargement can be one way to get there. And the reason that enlargement is a way to get there is because historically, the two processes have gone together and have reinforced each other. So, I mean, if you think of the creation of the single market, because it was mentioned, and the launch of major cohesion policies, they happened alongside the Southern enlargement in the 1980s. You had then the Maastricht Treaty with the single currency, deeper foreign and security cooperation, new fields in justice and home affairs, which was signed just as the preparations for the Nordic and Austrian accessions in the 1995 were going on. And then, of course, the Lisbon Agenda for Growth and Jobs in the Constitutional Convention, which set the stage for the Big Bang enlargement, right, in 2004 and 2007, which eventually culminated in the Lisbon Treaty. So the two have gone in tandem historically, and they can definitely continue to go on in the same way in the future. And the final thing I would add that at this point in time, it would also make sense, given that the process has lost some credibility over the past decades. So if the EU were to start reforming and start taking some steps in the direction of reform and preparing for future enlargement, it would certainly send a good signal to those countries who are expected to take on reforms. And if they reform themselves, then certainly member states are expected to be more open to enlargement.
And as I mentioned, the Council conclusions praising Ukraine for the steps that you have taken, Deputy Prime Minister. What this link between the two agendas, so the EPC has said we need the two things in tandem. We need the enlargement roadmap and we need the internal reform roadmap. And I'm wondering how you see the link between the two. It's the old debate about widening the EU versus deepening, because the European Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Kos, said at an EPC event in May, another democracy reform conversation, quotes, "We must not fall into the trap that thinking that without a change in the current rules, enlargement cannot succeed." How do you see, Deputy Prime Minister, the link between these two conversations? And do you agree that they should happen in tandem, and the consequence if they don't?
The question is, so that this is a political dilemma. So that's when you see the any projects like connected, then you have two perspectives: either they reinforce each other or they block each other. So
Yeah,
that's
voilà.
and that's why I agree with Commissioner Kos that enlargement should not be conditioned by domestic reforms or otherwise. Yeah, so that I think that these things are going together, and I think that together it means simultaneously, but not dependent to each other. So it's absolutely in the interest of candidate countries to join the effective, strong, and let's say ambitious EU. So that is really has regulation that fit to the future. And the domestic debate about the way how the EU is designed today, and this request for less rules, more freedoms, is something that resonates to Ukraine as well. So that's it's also it's true. But I think that what we definitely require is more that's something let's say not very typical for the EU. The EU by design is let's say very complex or very multidimensional policy entity. Yeah? So that with something that is really political maintained on the national level, and but now we really look for that this word sovereignty, that even if it is hidden in the term of strategic autonomy, is shifting to the EU level. And this is the essence of the problem for both for enlargement and domestic reform, that how we treat this European sovereignty. So as a set of 27 or 27 plus sovereignties that sometimes clash against each other, and this is unfortunately very close to the idea where to the concept that actually led to the historic failure of Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodów, so Polish-Lithuanian state in the middle, this liberum veto, when every member of Sejm has a right to veto a decision. Or we are talking about the common sovereignty, common approach to sovereignty of the continent. And then if we are talking about common sovereignty and sovereignty of the continent, then enlargement and domestic reforms are going together and perfectly fit each other. But this debate, so that I'm glad that this debate happens, and I see that there is no conditionalities, what comes first, what comes second. So that that's why I agree that we should not think into that direction and should do these things simultaneously, and we are capable to do this. Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that and play devil's advocate for a moment? If the EU moves down the enlargement road but doesn't, and we've seen, I mean, in the past, as was said, we have had successive widening and deepening simultaneously, but the appetite for internal EU reform is much less now than it was. Are you at all concerned that if the EU fails to reform itself, as you say, it's simultaneous, but one lags very far behind the other, that it will become less and less effective as a body, and therefore, for some countries, at least some candidate countries, it may be less attractive if the EU really cannot get its act together on the big issues of the day. Do you share a concern at all there, or do you think it's still a club that will remain enormously attractive to all candidate countries? And once you are in or in the waiting room, being part of that conversation, you can help to drive the sort of reforms that will be needed. Is there a dilemma here at all for you?
No, I think that this is, let's say, a hypothetical scenario. So that, but you know, every hypothetical things have the tendency to become real. Yeah, so that's why you cannot just
exactly
ignore them. Yeah, so that's it's true. So that first and foremost, I think that you know that what is the source of this thinking is that we have some let's say problems, political problems. Yeah, Ukraine with Hungary, so North Macedonia with its neighbor Serbia. So that's you know that everyone has some challenges. Yeah, so that's but then what we are doing meanwhile. So Ukraine and then Moldova, we are integrating into the EU sector by sector. So that we have roaming, we integrate roaming in starting from 1st of January 2026. Energy markets are integrating. So that's why Ukraine is there. So it's not like yes or no. It's like non-binary. Yeah. So that's non-binary enlargement. Yeah. So it's like more open on actual integration of Ukraine to the EU. So this is good as well. What we see is that new topics like defense is in the EU is developed together with Ukraine, at least in terms of thinking, in terms of designing. That in order for EU to be capable to defend itself, it should learn Ukrainian experience and use our technologies and our know-how that we apply now. So that's why I think that you know that we need to think. You see that there is a statement, yeah, so that the EU economy, let's say, rested on several delegations. Yeah, so that defense was delegated to the US, energy was delegated to Russia, and then purchase of EU products was delegated to China. Yeah, so that's why I think that, and it doesn't fit the ideology of regulation within the EU. This is the reality. Yeah, so this is not let's say trivial assessment of what's going on in the EU. And I think that is also that should be a starting point of thinking. What are the actual problems that the EU tries to reply when we are talking about current political agenda? So that how to maintain to be the best place to live on earth. So because the EU is best one. Yeah, so that's in terms of wealth, in terms of sustainability, technologies, everything. Yeah, so that how to maintain this, how not to become let's say a continent of failures. I think that the EU has enormous capability to defend its level of development. And even when we are talking about defense, so that's the last 4 years illustrated how many advanced military equipment is produced in the European Union. So it's not something like a topic of joke. There are a lot of things that
so
are
if I understand you correctly, Deputy Prime Minister, very much a sort of pragmatic, what do we need to do? How can we do it and move forward in that way? But Yanis, in your paper, you said the two processes must go hand in hand. And I mentioned Commissioner Koss and what she said at our event in May, and the Deputy Prime Minister there saying they should be simultaneous, but they should not be dependent on each other. How do you read it? I mean, is it realistic to say the two can go hand in hand at the simultaneously and complete at the same time? Or is it more a question of at least the two processes run, even if they run at very different speeds?
But let me start by saying, so that there's no misunderstanding, it's not about one or the other becoming a hostage of the other. It is about progressing both when it comes to enlargement, which is a geopolitical necessity. We all agree on that. But at the same time, also the EU progressing, at least gradually, when it comes to reforming itself. By the way, also now we're asking a good number of hypothetical questions. It also depends on how and when the EU will be enlarging. And will it be enlarging in many different steps, or will it be taking big enlargement steps? All these are big question marks which we cannot answer. But even independent of what the scenario, what the hypothesis is, the EU needs to reform itself. As Corinna was saying earlier, the EU needs to reform itself independent, by the way, of enlargement. It already was under reform pressure before we had definitely a new momentum when it comes to the enlargement debate since 2022, which obviously has to do with what happened in February of 2022. So there's a need to link both of these elements without them becoming hostage along the lines, and here I must say I was very positive about what the Deputy Prime Minister was saying, along the lines of the EU becoming more sovereign in a world which is becoming increasingly uncertain, where Europe needs to defend itself, by the way, in Europe itself, but also its interests beyond Europe. So you need to have an EU which has this drive to become more sovereign, which also means to have more shared sovereignty. And this is where members still very much struggle. There is an opposition among member states when it comes to reforming the EU more in depth, especially when it comes to issues related to what we call the EU's operating system. I'm not talking about governance because this always immediately rings the bell of the need for treaty change. But there is a need to change the EU's operating system in order for it to become more efficient, stronger, and more sovereign, as you were saying, Deputy Prime Minister. So these two elements need to be pushing in the same direction. But we're still seeing that member states, and I say this with a negative heart, that member states do still think that on the basis of where we are, with a bit of tweaks here and there, the EU can enlarge. And for me, that means you don't have the right mindset, both with respect to internal reform and with respect to enlargement. We
So
need to
when
be
you talked
much
earlier
more.
about,
We
yeah,
need to be much more ambitious when it comes to both elements.
okay. When you talked earlier about thinking enlarged, there's that side to it. And as you say, also thinking and including candidate countries in this discussion. Corinna, a brief one on this. And then I want to talk about the other countries and the process by which Ukraine very much front and center of the discussion at the moment. But Deputy Prime Minister talked about Moldova and the Western Balkans. How I'd like to get a perspective from you in a moment, Deputy Prime Minister, on how you see how enlargement should happen. One country, lots of countries, what happens after one joins and you don't close the door on the others. But Corinna, just a final comment on this question of the reform process and the enlargement process in tandem, but not dependent on each other.
Well, I mean, the risk of the two processes moving at different speeds is actually precisely why enlargement and internal reform must be conceived as two sides of the same strategic project. And this is what we argue in the paper. So linking the enlargement roadmap with a comprehensive EU reform plan, as we do in the paper, is meant to prevent them from evolving sort of independently from each other, and to ensure that progress on one reinforces rather than conditions progress on the other. So in practice, this means synchronizing the two agendas and calibrating their timelines so that the Union grows stronger as it grows larger. That's what we argue in the paper. Blocking enlargement because reform is incomplete would certainly be counterproductive. It would perpetuate paralysis on both fronts. So instead, I think enlargement should be used as a catalyst to drive reform, and reform should make enlargement more credible and sustainable. This is the virtuous cycle I was trying to invoke earlier.
Thank you very much. Deputy Prime Minister, let me come back to where we started, and I quoted Antonio Costa talking about enlargement as the best geopolitical investment the EU can make. In terms of the challenge at this geopolitical juncture, if for the time being, member states were to say, okay, Ukraine, we recognize the geopolitical imperative, we admit Ukraine. but we really can't go further than that. Or maybe we admit Ukraine and we admit Moldova, but Western Balkans, yet again, sorry, you have to wait. How do you see that process of you joining and others joining? And I'm mindful here of again, referring back to the EPC paper, they talk about two options that they think are possible. One they call speedy Big Bang, which is a bit like happened in 2004. You get a lot of countries all joining together. They think that's not politically realistic, but it should be kept on the table. The one they think is more likely is what they call strategic regatta. So countries join in consecutive waves, but it's driven both by geopolitical imperative and by the merit-based approach. How do you see the process? Do you think it should be a number of countries together, just Ukraine followed by the others? And what would you do about, to avoid what is happening now with Hungary, that countries join and close the door behind them to other new members?
Oh, so a lot of questions,
questions there.
and yeah,
First is how,
ideas, yeah, and
what,
ideas from what I heard from colleagues, yes, that. So I think that we need to bear in mind yet another lesson of history lesson, so that the Jacques Delors project on internal market went hand in hand with, as correct me if I'm wrong, but with so-called Luxembourg process of reapproachment between the EC at that moment and EFTA states, and it also lasted for several years in combination with reform of the economic community at that moment and relations with non-EC Western European states. Yeah, and what is interesting is that it resulted in creation of European Economic Area, but at the same time, among the members of European Economic Area, Norway intended to join the European Union, but decided to stay outside of the European Union and be a member of European Economic Area. But Finland, Finland, Sweden, and Austria initially intended to be a part of European Economic Area, but joined the European Union because of geopolitical changes and the fall of Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the change of geopolitical architecture of Europe. So I think that the similar notes are present in the current moment of the European Union. Definitely the promise of integration of the Western Balkans creates very particular thinking that this promise should be let's say implemented and taken seriously, and definitely everyone has its own let's say story behind its I'm talking about candidate states. So that's why this is not in this particular case, this is not a unifying story behind candidate states like in these 2004-2007 enlargement. It was really, let's say, post-Soviet, yes, or a unification of Europe. So now it's maybe unifying story is on the side of the European Union, how the European Union sees itself with Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova. And this is exactly what Ursula von der Leyen said in the State of the European Union speech about the completion of reunification of Europe. So this is a big project, and I think that within this project, and it is possible to complete this enlargement process, even if Ukraine and Western Balkans are having like different, let's say, dramaturgy of enlargement. Yeah, so that's why I think that we need to see it from this perspective. Otherwise, in terms of, let's say, speed of accession, whether it like I think that we need to stick to the merit-based enlargement, and this is quite important, and really to think about this as a merit-based. It means that not only to, let's say, check with scrutiny all check boxes, but also to see whether institutions that are required to be established in Ukraine are really operating, and that this is what happens in Ukraine, so that we are really changing ourselves, sometimes not in very, let's say, glance or glamour way, so that it's you know, sometimes, you know, that's something that really works maybe not looks like very, let's say, shiny. And
And
just to complete
Sorry.
on this, I think that it's really for the EU to let's say to frame this enlargement, and then everything can be done fast. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and just on this point, again, referring back to the EPC's proposals on this, they talk about the need for what they call a confidence clause. And what they mean, as I understand it by that, is you would need a mechanism to prevent a new member from shutting the door behind them, i.e. preventing, so I'm in now, I'm then going to block anybody else joining. Would you support that? Do you think it's needed? How do you view that? And then I'll come back to Corinna and Yanis.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, and I think that so that it's not a legal thing. It's like this is a profound political thing that should exist beyond the, let's say, political cycle. So that's more, let's say, long-term strategic understanding on between all states of the European, all member states. I think that what happens in member states neighboring to Ukraine. Now it's very visible in Hungary, but it's generally like for the member states that joined in 2004, 2007. I think that it was an enlargement of dream of transformation, with bringing a lot of prosperity, finances, cohesion funds to these states. And now there is like a consciousness that these states are developed states, so that Poland is has GDP more than 1 trillion euros. It has GDP per capita bigger than Japan. So it means that this project of transition is successful, and that's why it brings more this noblesse oblige, so that this obligation part to this. And that's why I think it should be really clear and conscious that if the EU project of integration of the EU is so successful for countries in transition, like post-Soviet countries, then they should bear in mind that they have no moral grounds for blocking from the further enlargement of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Corinna, to the question of whether simply admitting Ukraine at this point would be enough to respond to the geopolitical imperative, or how you see the connection between the current focus on Ukraine and to an extent Moldova, but it always seems the Western Balkans gets forgotten in these conversations. How do you see that geopolitical imperative now, and how important is it for you that the Western Balkans, that Moldova are part of that response to the geopolitical imperative?
Okay, well, to that question, but then I want to come back to some of the things that have been said. Well, I think it would be a misguided approach to only allow one country, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's Montenegro, because Montenegro is the other country about which we've heard about an imminent accession. I think if enlargement were to stop just with to stop at one or two countries, it would be a mistake. And especially if for the others, the promise would continue, if the process would continue as business as usual, dragging on, procedural, uninspiring, I think we're going to continue to pay the costs of such stagnation. I mean, the slow pace of enlargement has already eroded public trust in the European project across the Western Balkans, and also for political elites in the region who have become disillusioned and increasingly susceptible to the influence of external actors whose agendas don't always align with Europe. And I think that will continue. So it would certainly not spell good news if enlargement were to happen to only one or the other country and stop after that. In general, I would say, though, is that it's very nice to say that the process should be merit-based as well as responding to the geopolitical imperative with urgency. I think that's, we would all want to have our cake and eat it too. But I think in reality, such a mantra is very difficult to sustain. And I think that's why you have the two options that we put forward in the paper, because in the Big Bang option that we propose, in reality, what we try to argue for is to switch the focus of the conditionality of this merit-based approach from the pre-accession period to the post-accession period. So you take a leap of faith and then you focus more on what happens after and on reform and on strengthening the EU, whether it's through reinforcing rule of law and democratic mechanisms, whether it is through this confidence clause, meaning that countries would not block each other or would not cause issues once inside the union, whether it's about dealing with vetoes in the decision-making process. So it would literally be a change of mindset from focusing on on a very rigorous but very tedious and quite frankly, it hasn't worked out so far for the Balkans for 2 decades process to actually dealing with whatever problems might come up post-accession. So that's basically the spirit of this Big Bang option that we put on the table. Whereas the other one is basically a commitment to enlarging in waves, leaving flexibility on what these waves are, and intertwining this wavy process with reform of the EU. So that would be the closest we could possibly envision getting to having a merit-based as well as an urgent process.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we still do have the Deputy Prime Minister with us. He's just turned his camera off for a moment, and I do want to give him a last word in a moment. But Yanis, your reaction to what the Deputy Prime Minister said and are you okay for a couple more minutes, Deputy Prime Minister?
Sure. I'm with
Thank you
Yana.
very much. I can see you're on the move. I'm really grateful to you for doing this. Yanis, just a quick one to this, and then I would like to give the Deputy Prime Minister the last word.
2 remarks. First one, what we're talking about is very much a historical process. And I think we need to have that in mind. So when you were referring to the 90s and to the enlargement at the time, but also if you go back to the 70s, to the 80s, there was always, and the 2000s, there was always a historical argument and clarity that enlargement is of a historical significance.
Yep.
And I think that needs to be the basis today. So if some say the EU should not enlarge, this is something which I think all of us would disregard of being the wrong historical decision. But also limited enlargement would be the wrong historical decision. Because I would even call it, if we would only have a very limited enlargement, 1 or 2 countries, that in many ways there's a danger that that will be a fig leaf enlargement. And we do not, under historical circumstances, cannot afford to have a fig leaf enlargement. The second point is we need to see enlargement as an opportunity, but that's also something which citizens need to be aware of. And now I mean also, especially also citizens in the EU 27. Corinna was referring to some disillusionment in the Western Balkans, but also among the EU 27. We need to take citizens on board so that they understand that enlargement is an opportunity and is actually in their interest. It is not something which we're doing as a favor. It is in our, to quote Mario Monti, enlightened self-interest of the EU, its member states and citizens to enlarge the European Union. And that requires a lot of homework still.
Thank you. Deputy Prime Minister, a final word from you, if I might, and then I'll let you go. And it links to what Yanis just said about this always being recognised as historical decisions on enlargement. The paper says Europe must pass the test of times and adds, history is calling, but will Europeans come to the rendezvous? What do you believe the consequences will be for you, for Ukraine, and for the EU if they don't? You started with a very positive, upbeat, optimistic message about how you believe it will happen. But to those who waver, to those who doubt, what would you say about why it is so important to respond to this historical moment and to the geopolitical imperative?
I think that it goes like deep to the concerns of those who are skeptical to modern politics, those who are opposing enlargement, opposing many reforms, and people who are actually stuck in the crisis of cost of living. I think that for this part of European society and political, let's say part of political debate in Europe, so that enlargement is a solution, so that the reform of internal market is a solution. And the problem is that it is not yet visible. Yeah, so that the biggest challenge is just really to prove that it works this way, and this is a political task, a political challenge for all of us. So, but in reality, in substance, I strongly believe that that EU farmers who are opposing Ukrainian products on the EU markets really will win from Ukrainian integration to the EU, and this is our task, to pursue this agenda, to change the perception from negative to something more promising. So that's why I think that these intellectual debates that organized by EPC are really useful for finding this new vocabulary and new language that resonates to the deepest concerns of European societies. Thank you.
Deputy Prime Minister,
you.
thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your ideas, and being so frank about the process, both the positives and the negatives. We really, really appreciate you being with us today. Thank you to Corinna. Thank you to Yanis as well for joining us. We will be back next month with another EU democracy reform conversation. But for now, thank you for joining us, and goodbye.